Hey, it's time for diversity. Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm gonna try to do a short one. I'm trying to squeeze one. I got two videos. Here's the first one. It's about implicit bias. It's a topic that's sort of come up, but I wanted to give you some ideas behind implicit bias and what it means. It really ties into a lot of the white fragility argument, and it is now sort of the basis of a lot of research. And research-based practices, evidence-based practices, is what we like to say. So I want to give you kind of a textbooky definition of implicit bias that we can put up here on the screen. The implicit bias refers to the relatively unconscious and relatively automatic features of prejudice, judgments, and social behavior. Implicit bias refers to relatively unconscious and relatively automatic features of prejudice, judgment, and social behavior. And the way this really started coming out was after the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, in which a young black man, unarmed, was killed, one of many such shootings in 2016. There became a clear issue around race and policing. I mean, there always has been. There has been for a long time. It's one of the reasons that cities were on fire in the 1960s were because of racist policing. And we fixed some of that, but other parts of it we have just ignored. And so this issue around implicit bias in law enforcement came up, this idea that there might be an ingrained racial element among police officers. And the point about implicit bias, it's among all people. But there was a moment in 2016 in the vice presidential debate. I remember I was watching. It was Mike Pence and Tim Kaine, Hillary Clinton's running mate. Nobody remembers that far back. What happened to that? During the debate, Mike Pence, the governor of Indiana, had this sort of moment where they were talking about implicit bias, and he just so got it wrong. I remember just cringing. He said, "Enough of this seeking every opportunity to demean law enforcement broadly by making the accusation of implicit bias every time a tragedy occurs." The point is, we all have implicit bias. It's in all of us, not just white cops. And the guy missed the point completely. And the idea about, excuse me, implicit bias, as we've been talking about, is the built on this notion of internalization. That we internalize a lot of messages. We internalize messages about race, about gender, about sexual orientation, about ability, about religion. We internalize these notions of what's normal that sociologists refer to as socialization, and they feel very natural. They feel very natural to us. I mean, people who grow up in very conservative environments can't understand homosexuality unless they know someone who is, and then they start to like break through that. But it just seems so wrong. Like, how can people do that? I don't understand how A fits into A. All that silliness. So it can weave really deeply into our psyche. And we talked about sort of the cognitive development, about how we dig out these roots in our synapses that send us these messages, which are sometimes incorrect. So implicit bias isn't the idea that people with bias are bad people. We got to divorce ourselves from that, and that's what D'Angelo really wants to do in her book, is stop saying those racists over there are bad people, and us good people over here who are colorblind. It's woven into all of us. We all pick up this on a very early age. And so it is a way that our brain often plays tricks on us. And our brain often gives us messages that are not right. The first thing we think, it's not first thought, best thought. It worked for Jack Kerouac when he was writing On the Road. But for the rest of us, sometimes the first thought is completely wrong. And I'll give you an example from a famous psychological study, which is this image of a green column on a checkerboard. Okay, you see this image, and then when you look at this image, the question is, which of these squares is darker, A or B? A or B? Which square is darker? Right? And the brain immediately sort of tells you something. And then if you really look at another picture of that image, of that same image of the chalkboard, and realize A and B are the exact same tone, you realize your brain was lying to you. And the first time I saw this little trick, and I'll go back and forth so you can see the difference, I was so confused. I'm like, wait, of course, when you go back to the original, B is lighter than A. A is darker. A is a dark square. But, we have this idea of the shadow. We're processing this information, and we don't realize that they're the exact same color. So there are all these tests that show us how people misinterpret this thing. So this next image I want to show you is something that's given to first graders. It's a famous study on implicit bias. and these are first graders, so these are 6-year-olds, right? These are about the age of Cozy. They give this image, and it's 2 images. They're almost identical, except for the race changes. And on the image, in one image, it's the boy, Scott, who's down on the ground, and Bobby is standing behind him. On the other image, it's Alex, who's down on the ground, and Chris is standing behind him. And they ask these first graders, white and black, what's going on in a situation where Alex is on the ground and Chris is standing behind the swing? Well, Alex fell off the swing. They asked the same 6-year-olds, the same first graders, what's going on in an image where Scott is on the ground and Bobby is behind the swing. And these 6-year-olds say, Bobby pushed Scott off the swing. 6 years old, right? How do they know? What other information do they have other than the race of the kids and where they're standing? So already at 6, there is a sort of rapid fire response. Before there's any active analysis of what's coming out of the mouth, there is this notion that black equals threat, black equals bad. And I mentioned this, with regards to Cozy watching a Family Feud episode and rooting for the white family and she didn't know why. She just knew the white family, in her already preconceived notion, was somehow more deserving of winning the beautiful prize of the Family Feud, which is like $1,300. Than the black family was. Already she had coded out. When I asked her about it, I'm like, why, Cozy? You have African-American friends. We have all kinds of family friends. She's surrounded by positive images of blackness as much as a white family, white and brown family can provide. And she didn't know. She had just already picked up that message very early on. And it's kind of sad to think how early we learn. So implicit bias is way in the back of our heads. And it's not something that you picked up, on the internet. And so there's been all this science, and I just want to mention some of these studies briefly. My favorite one was done by one of my colleagues at Portland State University, and she looked at implicit bias around the issue of race in pedestrians. And so the idea of this study, real simple, was that when you're driving and you see someone about to cross the street, especially when they're crosswalk, the law is you have to stop and let them cross. I hope you know this, right? You have to let those people cross. And what she did for this real simple experiment is she just got some subjects who are or Confederates, people who are working for her, to go up and stand in intersections and wait to cross. And some of those Confederates were white people, and some of them were black people, black males, black females, white males, white females. And what she found, surprise, surprise, is that cars were more likely to stop for white people, including cars driven by minorities were more likely to stop for white people. And when they did stop for black people, they were more likely to be very close to the line. Instead of giving them a lot of space, would be right up on the edge, kind of in like an intimidating way. And so, you think about when you're driving, and that's, you're not thinking about, oh, I'm a racist, or I'm not a racist, I'm a racist. There's just a person standing there, and the odds are, based on this research, if they're white, you're more likely to stop. Doesn't mean you're a bad person, doesn't mean you're an evil white supremacist, just means you've internalized these messages. Because similarly, even though you colorblind people who grew up around black people and, blah, 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 if there's a black person winding across the road, you're more likely to blow right past them. This is what the research shows. We also know that this pops up in education all the time, including, I hope you watched the video that I sent you. I'll include a link to it on the bottom of this lecture video. The way that teachers discipline black students is more severe than the way they discipline white students, even if the white students are actually misbehaving more. Their eyes tend to follow the black students more. Just think about the eyes of security or shop managers when a black person walks in the store. They naturally sort of code in the back of their head, not in the conscious, implicit is the unthought thought, the back of their head, uh-oh, there's a threat. And remember the story I told about the kid sitting on the front of the steps of my daughter's preschool, and how I kind of immediately was like, uh-oh. That was an implicit bias reaction. Something was happening in the back of my head that I learned very early on. So we also know this turns up in these famous hiring studies that have been done, where you have 2 applications that are sent into the same job, and one, you give them a very white sounding name. Think of the whitest white person name that you can think of. And the other, you give them a sort of stereotypical black name. and which of the equally qualified applications, which of course are people that don't exist, we're sending it into all these job sites, and guess who's more likely to get the call? Brad is more likely to get the call than Tyrone. And even when you make Tyrone, the black applicants, the imaginary black applicants, credentials, resume longer and more qualified for the job, the white applicant still gets more calls. How is that? How's that working, right? There's something that's firing on people's brains. So there's a real important piece here about why this can matter. In hiring, I mean, I could tell you, I've been on a ton of hiring committees, and you get down, you have this big pool of candidates, and you get down to the final three. And what you end up doing is, like, the person that you feel, let's hire that guy. I think I'd like to have a beer with him. I feel like I can hang out with that person. Even though I probably will never hang out with that person, there's just something, well, he or she is like me, let's pick them. And so it's an unconscious way that a lot of people of color are blocked out of job opportunities because of that implicit bias. I think about it when grading, right? I mean, it's a little bit different this quarter, but I know kind of in the class who's white and who's not. And I wonder when I'm evaluating people's papers, their assignments, their exams, is there something in the back of my head that's grading them differently? There are some schools where you just turn everything in by your student number, and your name is never on anything, which makes sense in many ways. In a class like this, we want to try to have more of a personal connection, but it opens it up to implicit bias, where this really comes into play, besides all this research on how we discipline schools and how professors reply. There's been a study that found that professors reply to students that are white more often than students that are not white. I mean, just professors, right? We're supposed to be the smart ones. Where this really comes into play is in police interactions with potential threats. And this is where people literally get killed. So the scenario is an officer, doesn't have to be a white officer, and a police officer, having learned these messages, including the message that black equals threat, is in two different scenarios. One is there's something going on, because in policing, a lot of it is not like the movies. All of a sudden, you're in the middle of some situation, and you got to figure out what's going on. They're both the same situation. One is a black male, and one is a white male. What we see over and over again is the white male, there's some de-escalation. Let's go talk to them. It looks like they maybe might have a gun, so let's ask them if they have a gun. The black male, black equals threat, bam! That's it. And it turns out they don't have a gun. I mean, how many times have you seen these, including at these anti-COVID rallies where these people are like, infect me, what have I got to lose? White guys walking around with guns. Right? White guys walking around with guns. Police are just like, yeah, whatever. Black guy walks around with a gun, probably going to be an issue. There's a very interesting story about how the Black Panthers in 1967, formed in Oakland, California, wanted to demand their right to protect themselves, and marched into the state capitol in Sacramento and accidentally marched into an open session of the state legislature fully armed. And all of a sudden, all these conservative Republicans voted for gun control. Because once you got black guys with guns, we need gun control. White guys with guns, it's fine. Black guy with gun, black kid with Skittles gets shot, if you remember the story of Trayvon Martin. So these are all examples of implicit bias, where implicit bias can really mean life or death. But it's also important who gets hired, or who gets a higher grade, or who gets the sort of shoulder shrug. And so when we talk about this, these studies and the impact on young people, think about this notion of cumulative trauma that we were talking about before. Think about, what that means as it adds up. And there are multiple ways we can think about the cumulative effect of all these implicit bias experiences that are happening from teachers, that are happening from law enforcement, that are happening from bosses or potential bosses, that are happening from girlfriends and boyfriends. I mean, all this sort of body language, all these little scratches that happen can have impacts on education and how they make it through school, right? Do you make it to the end of 12th grade? Are you encouraged to go to college? Are you told, you're a thug, and therefore, why am I going to think about you on a pre-college track? And so there can be educational outcomes that start very early on because of people's implicit bias. It can impact people in terms of the reaction of law enforcement, how they feel about the police. You know, when I moved into this neighborhood in Northeast Portland, it is what traditionally was an African American neighborhood. We're going to have to talk about gentrification. I'm realizing we're going to have to talk about gentrification in here. But I was here, you know, for a couple of days. I saw a police officer coming down the street, and I flagged him down because I, you know, as a criminologist, I wanted to meet my local police officer, and he just laughed like, "Oh yeah, you know, only white people want to meet cops. You know, the people of color are running from us." Well, why is that? Because there's a cumulative negative experience with law enforcement based on implicit bias. We have the impact on hiring, which, you know, can impact the amount of money you make over the course of your life. Are you going to be able to afford to go to college? Are you going to be able to get a career instead of a job? Are you going to be able to buy a home and start accumulating some wealth, right? Those economic factors are all connected to your ability to get a job. As we said, impact on grading and, you know, how your GPA looks at the end of your high school year, or do you have, you know, negative interactions with professors in college because they're working on some implicit bias? That person needs to try harder when they're giving, you know, the white students more leeway. How we assess cases in the legal system, and, you know, how we write people off as problems. That, you know, well, they come from a bad neighborhood, and so they're going to be put in a sort of separate category from the good kids from the good neighborhood who just, you know, messed up. The kids from the bad neighborhood, they're chronic troublemakers. The kids from the good neighborhood, yeah, you know, they're like me. And so I was like that. I was stupid when I was a kid. Let's let them go, right? Those types of case assessments early on create lifelong trajectories and build and build and build. And just sort of the lower expectations, having lower expectations, especially in this case for people of color. So if you add all of that, right, all of that and more that we're not getting to, you're going to start to build trauma. You're going to start to build something in people that looks like that scratch that is a wound and now is an open sore and now is a gaping wound that will not heal. So when we talk about implicit bias, it's not just a little thing like, oh, sorry, I just made a snap judgment and it was wrong, right? I mean, that's what it is at the root. It's the unthought thought. But what is the impact? What is the impact of all this implicit bias on the recipients of that bias, right? The scratch that builds and builds and builds. So implicit bias, this is a little formula that we're trying to build here. You know, we're talking about it's not the intent, it's the impact, right? That's our motto now. It's not the intent. It's not, I didn't mean anything by it. I'm sorry. I just forgot I wasn't supposed to use that word, or I didn't mean to, you know, shrug when I saw you. It's not the impact, it's the intent. And that intent is cumulative and builds and builds and builds and has all the social ills that go along with any other type of trauma, whether it's war or sexual assault or child abuse, or it's the same traumatic devaluing and hurting and harming of people's psyche. So implicit bias is a powerful piece of this. We talk about, you know, people burning crosses and people committing hate crimes, and that's what racism looks like. Yeah, that's a piece of it. That's a tiny piece of it. But remember our pyramid, that there is a much more common version of racism that we all engage in, including people of color, right? Because they've internalized the same messages about race and gender, you know, all these things that anybody else has. I mean, women can have implicit bias against other women, right? We're internalizing these negative things, bitch, right? I mean, just think about how women treat each other, because devaluing women because they're women has been brainwashed in all of us, including women. So I really want us to be able to make this connection between implicit bias and trauma and be thinking about that. Okay, I told you I'd keep it short, under 20 minutes. Let's get out of here. Peace.